All rise, veuillez vous lever. Veuillez vous asseoir.
Good afternoon. We continue with hearing the prosecution's opening brief. Mr. Deputy Prosecutor, are you going to take over?
Non, non, elle va.
No, she is going to do it. I have got up to present my apologies from Khan, who was here this morning and had hoped to stay here throughout, but unfortunately, something has cropped up, and therefore he has asked me to send you his apologies. But there are no alternatives under the circumstances. I'd also like to introduce the new member who have joined the team, who weren't there this morning, Mrs. Liz Bam, Hishiro Amori, and Vanessa Hernandez. And now the senior trial lawyer Olomakwie will continue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Prosecutor. Yes, Ms. Makwe, please continue.
Good afternoon, Madam President, Your Honors. I will continue to address you with respect to the contextual aspect on war crimes against Mr. Said. Madam President, Your Honors, you will hear evidence from witness P1339, an anti-Balaka insider who received trainings by a pro-Bozize member called Alfred Yekatom in Kalangoi. He will state, and I quote, "We trained twice a day at 9 and at 14 hours in the bush, and we received military training from Rombo in the bush, including on how to use weapons such as machetes and knives." P1339 will further testify that these pro-Bozize forces in Kalangoi, Democratic Republic of the Congo, were receiving weapons and ammunition, including from Maxim Mokom in Zongo. Similarly, multiple prosecution witnesses, such as P0975, P0966, will speak about the military trainings in pro-Bozize structures at Gobere in the Central African Republic. Your Honors, at this time, the Seleka regime had already identified these forces as a security threat and were acting accordingly. For example, in a letter to the ambassador of the Democratic Republic of Congo on 3rd June 2013, Nureddin Adam, and this letter, Madam President, Your Honors, is now being portrayed before your screens. Nureddin Adam requested authority to deal with the pro-Bozize forces who had gathered in the Democratic Republic with the aim to destabilize the Seleka regime. You will also see in another slide, Madam President, Your Honors, that the pro-Bozize forces were engaged in financing and arming their forces. Witnesses will testify that these operations were not only discussed in meetings, but also in email communications. For example, two key members of pro-Bozizé forces, Steve Yambete and Charles Nkremangu, exchanged information on 19th July 2013. It's also before you, Madam President, Your Honors. Exchanged information on 19th July 2013 on the specific military needs to fight back the Seleka. You can see from this document being displayed in your screens, Your Honors, that they were also asking for supply. They were also asking for the supply of men in the 4 battalions, and in particular for a specific type of weapons, including ammunition. Another member of the anti-Balaka, Olivier Coudemont, as mentioned earlier, was also engaging in the preparatory activities from the Cameroonian border area. What Your Honors have seen on your screens, what Your Honors will next see are intelligence reports which were prepared by the Seleka-led government in the Central African Republic in July and August 2013 about such activities. These reports, Your Honors, are from the B2 intelligence. It was an intelligence office under the Seleka. The movement of pro-Bozizé forces were being monitored by these intelligence officers as demonstrated in these reports. It demonstrates that eventually, by mid to late 2013, the pro-Bozizé forces became what is now known as the anti-Balaka. It is the prosecution's submission, Your Honor, that in legal terms, this was still the same organized armed group, although now it has clearly come out and is being known as the anti-Balaka. It is still the same group that had been combating the Seleka continuously since late 2012. Madam President, Your Honors, you'll hear evidence that will demonstrate that within some 5 months of the Seleka taking power, the anti-Balaka launched major attacks and started taking back territory from the Seleka. For example, a major anti-Balaka attack occurred in September 2013 in Bossa Ngoa. You have before your screens now a map of the region, and we have highlighted for you the placement of Bossa Ngoa. Evidence from P0966, who participated in the attacks, states, and I quote, "Our strategy was to target little villages occupied by the Seleka around Bossa Ngoa in order to defeat smaller groups of Seleka and seize their weapons. Then would become strong enough to attack Bossa Ngoa where the Seleka were numerous," close quote. Your Honors, we shall now put before you an intelligence report prepared by the Central African government when the attack took place in early September of 2013. It reports the attack on Zere. It reports on the attack on Zere and the activities of pro-Bozizé forces in the area. Madam President, Your Honors, the B2 was a government military intelligence bureau based in the Camp de Roux, and it analyzed and gathered intelligence. You will see from the documents we've displayed that it reported over 1,000 combatants participated in the attack in the areas of Bosangoa and Bwaka. That these combatants were divided into 6 groups. This is displayed in front of you, Madam President, Your Honors. From the intelligence reports before you, Madam President, you can see the coordination with the B2, which is now advising the Seleka government to send more reinforcement to these regions which were being attacked. Another B2 intelligence document will be displayed shortly. And in this intelligence report, Madam President, Your Honors, it is clear that the anti-Balaka were more than mere villagers and youth who took up arms. This was not a group formed on the spur of the moment. They were sufficiently organized, trained, and armed to launch major attacks. Evidence to be led will show that by the 5th of December 2013, the anti-Balaka were capable and executed a large-scale coordinated attack on Bangui in an attempt to overthrow the Seleka. Your Honors, long-standing Bozizé allies like Maxime Mokom, Alfred Yekatom, and others oversaw this large-scale attack. With your leave, Madam President, I shall now address you on the contextual elements of the crime against humanity. The Seleka directed an attack against the civilian population of Bangui, perceived to be Bozizé supporters, that was both widespread and systematic. After taking power in March of 2013, the Seleka had no illusions. They knew that former President Bozizé and his allies were actively seeking to return to power. The Seleka knew well that a threat to their regime still existed. What do they do in response? Madam President, Your Honors, they set out to suppress any resistance to their regime. They did not distinguish between genuine political opponents and real security threats. Instead, they targeted any and all perceived Bozizé loyalists and supporters. How did they do this? You will hear from evidence to be led during the course of the trial that the Seleka identified perceived Bozizé supporters using a variety of factors. For example, they considered those to be associated with Bozizé to be a target. Of particular note, they targeted Christians, they targeted people of the Bayer, Manjar, or Banda ethnicity. And thirdly, they targeted former FACR or Presidential Guard members under Bozizé. Sadly, as you heard previously from Prosecutor Khan and Deputy Prosecutor Nyang, they also targeted residents of specific neighborhoods of Bangui, traditionally associated as supporting Bozizé. Your Honors, the crimes committed by Mr. Said and his subordinates at the OCRB formed part of this attack. But the attack also involved other incidents at other locations, including the 5 additional incidents described in the confirmation of the charges decision as detailed in the prosecution brief. It is our submission that these additional incidents also formed part of the attack against the civilian population, which included the following incidents in Bangui. Your Honors, in April 2013, the Seleka attack on the 7th arrondissement of Bangui and the operation of the Boy Rabe neighborhood was one such attack. In August 2013, and just to orient you a bit, Madam President, Your Honors, we do have a slide of the neighborhoods I'm speaking of. The 7th arrondissement is on the extreme right of the map, titled Location of Incidents. In August 2013, a second Seleka operation took place on the Boy Rabe neighborhood. This is found on number 2 and 3 of the map. There was also an attack on a minibus which was committed in the PK9 area at number 4 on your map, already described to you by the prosecutor and the deputy prosecutor in the morning. Also, the arbitrary arrests and detention at the Sedad. Madam President, these were large-scale attacks based on the Seleka's policy to attack densely populated residential areas inhabited by what they perceived to be Bozize loyalists. The most notorious attacks were committed against the Boy Rabe neighborhood in April and August of 2013. We will now present to you what we submit as Seleka vehicles which were used to patrol the Boy Rabe neighborhood during the April and August operations. It is the prosecution case, Madam President, Your Honors, that these were not security operations focused on neutralizing combatants. Your Honors, these operations were conducted under the command of Seleka leaders in execution of their policy to target what they perceived to be Bozize loyalists. You'll hear evidence from P0119, who described the operation as a collective punishment. He will tell you that Nuruddin Adam visited him a few days before the attack in April 2013. And I quote, he said, "He approached me and told me that some young men from Boy Rabe had joined the Seleka ranks only to escape afterwards with their weapons. He asked me to find them and for the weapons to be returned to the Seleka, or he would destroy Boy Rabe," end of quote. On another occasion, P0119 heard from a Seleka officer that, open quote, even when he was in the bush, he and the rebels were told to burn Boy Rabe and everyone in it, as its residents were Bozize loyalists, close quote. Your Honors, the Seleka's intention in executing these attacks is also clearly demonstrated when considering the types of victims and the types of crimes committed during these attacks. They were indiscriminate, Madam President, Your Honors. They targeted elderly people, women, young children, without any distinction. This was the modus operandi of the Seleka. In the next slide, Madam President, Your Honors, you will see the photograph of a woman named Sandrine of blessed memory and her baby, who were shot and killed by the Seleka at their house. Madam President. Sandrine and her baby were killed during the Seleka operation in the Boirabe neighborhood of April 2013. These were civilians. These were civilians, Your Honor. But the Seleka did not make that distinction, killing an innocent woman and her child. Evidence to be presented will demonstrate that many victims were shot, wounded, or killed during this operation. P0342 observed and took photographs of some of the victims as shown by the prosecutor during his submissions this morning. Your Honors, during the same operation, the Seleka raped multiple women. These were not opportunistic acts of one or two random individuals. For example, one victim described being gang raped for multiple days on the order of a Seleka commander. Now, during the 7th arrondissement and Boirabe incidents, the Seleka went door to door, looting homes from top to bottom. The looting, you will hear, during these incidents went on for days and involved hundreds of Seleka members. Witness P1825 was at Boirabe when the attack took place, and he was forced by the Seleka to participate whilst they looted. You will hear evidence from him that there were around 100 Seleka men looting houses on that day in Boirabe. Again, it is the prosecution case. These were not isolated events or opportunistic acts. The Seleka systematically targeted and attacked the property of non-Muslims. They used the so-called indicateurs, or informers, who pointed out the location of non-Muslim households. After such incidents, Madam President, these households and their occupants would be targeted, while the households of Muslims would be spared. P1825 states that the Seleka asked him to point out the houses of the Faka during the looting. He observed that while the Seleka entered into 2 Muslim houses, they did not loot anything from these houses because they were Muslim households. Witness P1427 and 1263 describe that the Seleka arbitrarily grabbed men and boys off the street in Boirabe, forcing them to lie on the ground in a row and executing them one by one. Additionally, at least 2 witnesses will describe how during the second major operation on the Boirabe neighborhood in August of 2013, they narrowly survived being executed. P1263 will give evidence that he was shot 4 times by the Seleka, but managed to survive. Your Honors, P1263 was a lucky man. He will tell you that those who lay right next to him, including a 12-year-old boy, did not survive. They were killed. In another episode or incident in July of 2013, the Seleka arbitrarily arrested and tortured and then murdered a group of individuals who were in a minibus, the so-called PK9 incident that you've heard submissions on earlier this morning. The victims of this bus, Madam President, Your Honors, were targeted because the Seleka found a bag which contained T-shirts printed with the former president's face. These passengers were stopped at PK9 checkpoint by the Seleka, taken to Camp de Rue, and murdered by the Seleka. Later, as you heard earlier, and as you saw in the photographs we displayed before you, their dead bodies were found floating in the river. Madam President, from mid-September 2013 to 8th November 2013, the Seleka also unlawfully detained and mistreated perceived pro-Bouzizi supporters at the Sedad, an intelligence bureau created by Jotodia and headed by Adam after the closure of the OCRB. They detained them in small, dark, crowded cells, systematically mistreating them. Some of the Sedad cells are before you on your screens, Madam President, Your Honors. Prosecution witnesses like P0664, a civilian, would testify how they were blindfolded, kidnapped, and detained without any information or access to justice at the Sedad in September of 2013, simply because they were considered supporters of Francois Bouzizi. Your Honors, Mr. Said was well aware of these additional incidents taking place in 2013 through his own involvement and because they were widely covered in the media. Witnesses will testify that Mr. Said was involved in Boy Rabbit operations in April and August. Several prosecution witnesses also placed their accused at the Sedad and attest that he continued to be involved with the Seleka station there. Your Honors, the crimes committed at the OCRB form part of the widespread and systematic attacks launched against the civilian population in Bangui at the relevant period charged. Before you, you have another map. Delineating the location of the various incidents that took place. It is our submission that the crimes committed at the OCRB were planned, coordinated, and overseen by Seleka commanders. They were executed according to a consistent pattern. And they were committed against many civilian people. They were committed on a regular basis over a sustained period of time. The Seleka operations in April and August in Boy Rabe, the April attack on the 7th arrondissement, the attack on the passengers of the PK9 minibus, the arbitral arrests and detentions at the Sedad, also demonstrate advanced planning and coordination by Seleka leaders, resulting in many civilian victims. The evidence will demonstrate further that at the time relevant to the charges, the Seleka directed a widespread and systematic attack against the civilian population of Bangui, perceived to be Bouzizi supporters. Madam President, Your Honors, during the course of this trial, the prosecution will present a focused and compact case. The prosecution will lead direct evidence, testimonial, and documentary evidence to prove its case. The prosecution will prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the accused before you today, Mr. Said, committed the crimes, induced the crimes, or ordered and enabled other perpetrators. With these remarks, Madam President, Your Honors, I conclude the opening of the prosecution's case against the accused, Mr. Said. I thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Makwe. Ms. Pillay, please. For the records for the victims.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Your Honour. Your Honours, together with Mr. Dibert Bekoy, who against his will was unable to attend today due to an air controller's strike, we've represented since 27th May 20 victims who are participating in the trial that is starting today before you. In addition, 22 applications for participation are still pending. These are the 19 applications that were sent to you on the 13th of July and 3 additional applications sent on the 12th of September. All the victims allowed to participate in the proceedings have therefore demonstrated a causal and connecting link between the crimes suffered and the accused, Mr. Said. Indeed, they all demonstrated that they were arbitrarily arrested and detained at the Central Office for the Repression of Banditry, OCRB, between the 12th of April and the 30th of August 2013. Some of them were never formally charged. Others were charged, sometimes with retroactive effect. Some of them were tortured and were all subjected to cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment. Some of them were eventually discharged after several days or even several weeks, whilst others died as a result of the inhuman treatment inflicted during their detention. And Your Honours, in the context of the opening statements, it is important that the voice of victims is accurately relayed and communicated. To do this, we've consulted the victims, and before the hearing, these statements are a rare and valuable opportunity for victims to present their views and concerns, their expectations, their fears in a more general way, without being restricted by the need to justify a specific interest and without having to limit their submissions to a particular issue, which is the subject of debate between the prosecutor and the defense. The fact that victims are unable to come in person to speak to you today should not be used as a reason or constitute an impediment to the exercise of their rights under the Rome Statute. It is therefore essential at this stage that the Chamber, for the Chamber to hear from the victims, at least through their legal representatives, so that the Chamber can understand the extent of their sufferings and the extent of the damage that these heinous crimes have caused to the victims. These opening statements made on their behalf are not evidence, they're just the transmission of the views and concerns of the victims, which have been shaped necessarily by their experience. In order to comply with your decision on the conduct of the proceedings, and in particular paragraph 9 thereof, I will refer to the victims by the number assigned to them by the Victims' Participation and Reparations section. But let there be no mistake, behind this figures and numbers, there are real men, women, and children who are brave. And I must protect their identity. The victims were invariably imprisoned in inhumane conditions, deprived of food and water without being formally charged or charged with retroactive effect, simply because some of them lived in Boy Rabe, neighborhood considered by the Selika as to be one of Bouzize's strongholds in 2013 because some of them were members of the FACA or simply suspected of being so. Because some of them had practiced their profession under the overthrown administration, because some of them were suspected of being linked to the drafting or distribution of pamphlets calling for Jitodia's resignation, even though they had nothing to do with the pamphlets in question, or simply because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, and because the Selika considered this made them supporters of Bouzize. And indeed, the victims participating in the proceedings today all testified through their accounts of the events that victimized them to the particularly cruel nature of the crimes committed against them, but also to their systematic and widespread nature. Detainees at the OCRB were systematically beaten on their arrival, very often lying bare-chested, covered with water and sand in order to amplify the pain. A 7029122 recalled thinking that he would be beaten to death, and as if this were not enough, a 7029322 explained that he was then beaten with whips, gun butts and iron bars as the prisoners walked into their cells. The same fate befell A7030122 and others. A7030422 was trampled upon and had a knife held to his throat, and his threatened that his throat would be slit. A7030122 narrowly escaped execution at the hands of the accused. Your Honours. A7029522, A7029922, A7030022, and A7030522 felt that they were very lucky not to have been tortured while in detention, because the screams of the tortured prisoners they heard when they were detained at the OCRB still echo in their heads today. A bar 70 or 30222 was less fortunate, subjected to the abattoir torture, which was explained by the prosecutor and the deputy prosecutor, and I'm not going to go into detail. He would have wanted the Selika elements to finish him off as the pain was unbearable. Instead, they hung him from the fence of the OCRB for several hours before throwing him into the basement cell located under the office of the accused himself. The after effects of this torture were such that the prosecutor in Bangui at that point of time ordered the accused to be released immediately, as the detention was no longer compatible with his health. Prisoners were then thrown into cells so small that they could not lie down and could not and only could sit in turns or by crossing their legs. There were no windows, and it was so overcrowded that the prisoners found it difficult to breathe. Breathing was made even more difficult by the stench that reigned because there were no toilets or latrines. Of course, their wounds were not treated. A70301, A70302, A7030422, and A70306/22 were thrown into a cell under Mr. Said's own office. A7030422 explained that this cell was like a dustbin full of rubbish and excrement. It smelt of death, and he could not lie down in it because it was so filthy. Your Honours, all the victims report the fact that they were not given water, except they were not nourished by the jailers, but were fed only when their families had found them, usually after searching for days throughout Bangui. The conditions of detention had only improved for those who had been transferred to the Ngaraba prison. A702-9022 explained that they felt safer there. Although the majority of victims involved in these proceedings are men, women weren't spared. A7030522, a young woman in her 20s at the time of the events, was mistreated from the moment of her arrival and throughout her detention at the OCRB, and only narrowly escaped a number of sexual assaults thanks to the intervention of a detainee whom the Seleka elements seemed to respect, despite her status as a detainee. However, since her release, she's been stigmatized by the people in the neighborhood who think that she was defiled during her detention. It's a double whammy, Your Honours. After being beaten, A7029622 was thrown into a cell with her 4-month-old baby when she insisted on seeing her partner, who was detained at the OCRB. She and her baby were held almost 24 hours without food or water. Your Honours, the suffering inflicted on the victims we represent is such that words cannot describe it. Over time, their scars have, for the most part, faded, but they still suffer in their flesh and in their minds. Some are still physically hindered as a result of the physical torture. Others report having nightmares almost on a daily basis. And all find it very difficult to forget all this. The victims' lives are marked forever by the events at the OCRB in 2013. In addition to the physical and psychological scars, they all need to understand the reason for this inhuman treatment in order to rebuild their lives on a better basis and to try and forget, even though the security climate that prevails in the Central African Republic today does not contribute to their daily well-being. Indeed, their former tormentors have been incorporated into the army, the gendarmerie, or the police, or continue to hold high positions within the Central African administration. According to A7028922, and I quote his own words, "This is the price of peace," end of quote. A very expensive price to pay, Your Honours. The defense repeatedly points out that the scope of the charges in this affair is rather narrow, particularly in view of their limited nature in time and space, which you expressly recognized in your decision dated 6 September on the scope of the charges. And it is a fact that the charges against the accused that you're dealing with in this trial are limited in comparison with other cases pending before this court. Yet, Your Honours, there is no hierarchy of crimes within the jurisdiction of the court. All these atrocities defy imagination, beggar belief, and deeply shock the human conscience. All these crimes affect the entire international community. This barbaric side, whatever its scale, whatever its interpretation of the extent of the charges, reduces lives to nothing. And it's the origin of trauma that will never heal. And this is the case of the victims who are participating in the trial today. It is the case of those who've been forgotten. And the allegedly narrow scope of charges does not make them sub-victims. Contrary to what the defense will no doubt try to demonstrate during the trial that opens today, this is not a trial of the Selika, but the trial of Mr. Said. Mr. Said, a colonel in the Selika, was the de facto head of the OCRB when the victims were detained in abject and sometimes tortured conditions. As such, he played a key role in the execution of the common plan to target alleged Bouzizi supporters and to commit the crimes referred to in the decision confirming the charges against the OCRB between the 12th of April and the 30th of August 2013. The fact that his superiors are not present in the courtroom today does not change anything at all. It does not exonerate the accused. Mr. Said knew, Mr. Said encouraged and supervised the commission of the crimes against the victims. Mr. Said did nothing to prevent them when he did not commit them himself. It was he who decided the fate of the detainees in the OCRB. It was under his own desk that some victims were held in an underground cell in conditions which, as I've already mentioned, defy imagination. Mr. Said could not have been unaware of the inhumane conditions in which the victims were held. A 702-9422, A 7030022, A 7030122, and A 7030622 were placed in cells on the orders of Mr. Said. A 7030422 even explains that upon his arrival at the OCRB, the Selika elements waited for the accused to return so that he could decide himself in which cell he should be placed. A 7029722, a 7030122, and a 7030522 were interrogated by the accused himself while in detention at the OCRB, while a 7030122 was threatened with death by Mr. Said. A 7030622 even states that since he had been placed in the cell under the office of Mr. Said, he regularly heard Mr. Said questioning detainees and giving orders to his men to bring detainees to his office. So I agree that some victims have not named Mr. Said as their torturer. Some of them were not able to name their torturers. Many victims have not been able to identify their torturer other than by their membership of the Selika in their applications for participation. But, Your Honours, let us be clear on one thing. These are individuals who are disoriented, arrested without understanding the grounds of arrest, beaten up, thrown into cells where conditions beggar belief, mistreated, malnourished, and sometimes tortured. The victims were only thinking about their survival and were not thinking about identifying their torturers. The fact that the victims did not name Mr. Said by name does not mean that he is not responsible for the crimes they suffered directly or indirectly. It simply means that they did not know his name, or they were only concerned about their survival. Moreover, we Once again, during the trial, the defense will invoke the colonial past of the Central African Republic to try to justify the absence of criminal responsibility of Mr. Said. In this regard, the victims implore you to break out of this straitjacket and focus on the facts that are going to be presented throughout this trial. If the colonial past of the Central African Republic makes it possible to explain certain social and political phenomena, it does not absolve Mr. Said of his responsibilities. Mr. Said, regardless of his country's past, deliberately and wittingly committed the crimes we're dealing with, where some of his compatriots chose to behave otherwise, where thousands of Central Africans have behaved differently. Your Honours, it is important to remember the role of victims in the proceedings is not to make any accusations against the accused. This is the role of the prosecutor. Instead, the Rome Statute offers them the opportunity to participate in the judicial truth-finding process. This process is their only opportunity to try and make sense of what happened in 2013, almost 10 years after the events that victimized them. Some victims still do not know the reasons for their arbitrary detention. Others were tried and convicted for acts that were totally unrelated to them. All of them have suffered from the after effects, and this participation in the establishment of the judicial truth is very important for them. But their participation in today's trial is also essential in that it reminds everyone that the justice done in this institution is done on their behalf in order to preserve future generations from atrocities that defy imagination and deeply shock human conscience, and not to leave unpunished the most heinous crimes that affect the entire international community. The victims we represent all hope that the trial that opens before you today will bring justice, but also bring justice to victims who did not survive. They all hope that the trial that opens today before you will provide them with the explanations of the fate that befell them during the events that victimized them in 2013. They all hope that the trial that commences today will be a guarantee that such crimes shall never be committed again. The victims who are participating in the trial against Mr. Said have been waiting for almost 10 years to obtain explanations about what happened to them in the Osiabi jails. This trial, under your responsibility, is an important step in their reconstruction. I hope that their participation will remind everyone that there is nothing abstract about international criminal justice, that behind the facts and legal arguments there are men, women, children whose eyes are turned to you and who deserve to obtain, finally, answers with regard to their victimization. No victim is driven by a sense of revenge. Your Honours, like A7028922, they will not rest until there is peace and justice. Thank you so much for your kind attention.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Pile. Ms. Naure, it's close to 3:30. Would you want to start your opening address on behalf of the defense today and finish off tomorrow, if you may?
Merci, Madame le Président.
Thank you, Your Honour. I think for the clarity of our words, because it's been drafted in such a way, it would be better to start tomorrow and finish tomorrow. because we've got, but for it to be clear and fluid, the initial interventions will last for more than half an hour. So it is basically preferable to start tomorrow, but we are completely in your hands.
That's okay, in as much as we would have loved for you to start today so that we make use of the remaining 30 minutes, 35 minutes or thereabouts. If you think you're better off starting tomorrow, then I guess that would be it. I know you have 4.5 hours afforded you. I'm not sure how long you'd be on your legs tomorrow, but of course, like I said, when I, opened this session, would appreciate it if we do things, nicely, expeditiously, so that we get this trial up and running. So tomorrow would be your day to give us your opening address. If you could do it, for less than 4 hours, 30 minutes, we will appreciate. But we know that you're given 4.5 hours. Okay? Well, that would be it for today for this opening remarks by the prosecutor and counsel for the victims. I shall adjourn this matter and ask that we come tomorrow at 9:30 so that we hear counsel for Mr. Said. 9:30 it will be then. Thank you.
All rise.